Welcome for this first afternoon session of today. We will focus in this session on interprofessional collaboration. And I think actually for everybody who is involved in this field, it will be kind of logic that this team is in front here on the stage, because everybody knows that SIMM practices are often operating on the crossroads of different sectors, working with different types of organizations, involving different logics and different frames of reference. So how does this work? What is important to know? What is difficult in these interprofessional collaborations? This is what we will talk about. The first 4 speakers of today are involved in the same research project in Canada, but they will each shed another light on the research. So maybe this is important to know. And the overall theme of their research is decolonizing music education. So I would like to invite the first speaker for today. This is Anita Prest. She is Associate Professor of Music Education at the University of Victoria in Canada. Anita, we listen to you.
Thank you. Is this too loud, or is that okay? That's okay? Fantastic, thank you. So, and I'm just going to explain that the 4 of us have been involved with the same research project. Scott and I are going to be talking about it, and then Hector's going to talk about his postdoc research, and Beth is going to be talking about her PhD research. So, but it's all connected in a certain way. So, my name is Anita Prest. I'm a settler Canadian of Italian origin. My grandparents left Italy prior to World War I, immigrating to Montreal, where I was born and raised. I currently live and work on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples continue to have an ongoing relationship with the land today known as Victoria, British Columbia. I'm going to unpack that short paragraph. Notice that I speak about my relationship to the ancestors, to my ancestors and the land, and not to my work title. This is the way I've been taught to introduce myself by Indigenous research partners. According to CReARC, quote, situating ourselves can provide context for how we might approach our relationships with each other. It informs how we will interact with each other, end quote. I use the term settler Canadian. I don't know how to press that. Somehow it's, there we go, settler Canadian. To denote that my ancestors were not Indigenous to what we now call Canada, and that my country is grounded in and shaped by a specific form of ongoing colonialism, that is, settler colonialism. According to Wolff, quote, the primary object of settler colonialism is the land itself, rather than the surplus value to be derived from mixing native labor with it, as in exploitative forms of colonialism. Thus, settler colonialism's dominant feature is not exploitation, but replacement, end quote. Settler colonialism, states Cox, perpetuates the erasure of native peoples as a precondition for settler expropriation of lands and resources. I use the term traditional territory to indicate that the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples are treaty peoples. Between 1850 and 1852, their ancestors signed the Douglas Treaties, one of the few treaties signed in British Columbia. Most of the province is unceded land, which has modern-day judicial, legislative, and social implications around land use and Indigenous sovereignty. This dynamic of current power imbalance, ongoing Indigenous-specific racism, and sweeping systemic upheaval is the site of our research. Whoops. In this presentation, we share the initial findings of our most recent study, in which we sought to identify the locally situated educational practices that presently serve to enable music teachers and community partners in BC to foreground Indigenous worldviews and musics in their teaching practices. Our goal was to shed light on the complexities of enacting curriculum policy designed to bring Indigenous knowledge to all students. It is not yet possible to discuss what people have reported about the social impact of music making, of Indigenous music making in schools, as these efforts are in their infancy. And we wonder if the eventual impacts of such efforts are even determinable or measurable. But we will share some initial effects of our study. First, I describe the governmental and educational policies that have driven our research agenda and outline our methodological approach. Next, I share the overarching initial themes we generated from the conference workshops and guided conversation. Then, in the presentation following mine, Scott Goble discusses some of the knowledge shared and created during one of the conference sessions called the guided conversation. He shares some of the initial effects of the conference we held as part of our study. So first we're going to discuss policies. Both context and current policies drive our Indigenous co-led studies. Here, I briefly outline some governmental and educational policies linked to our work. At the international level, as Bridie Lee mentioned, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP as we know it, states that Indigenous people have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. In addition, the UN SDGs, the three that apply to our research are number 4, quality education, 10, reduced inequities, and 14 or 17, I believe, 17, partnerships to arrive at the goals. At the national level, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action contain 11 calls pertaining to education for reconciliation. At the provincial level, in 2019, the BC government passed the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or DREPA, establishing UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation. The framework is the foundation for 89 actions for which various ministries are being held accountable to implement between 2022 and 2027. One action is especially relevant to our study, Action 3.4, where they talk about implementing and co-creating culturally relevant provincial resources with Indigenous people for use by all educators across the K-12 education system. Kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum documents in all subject areas, including music, require educators to teach content and curricular competencies concerning Indigenous knowledge and perspectives. Correspondingly, the BC Teachers Council professional standards for education specifically state that educators must integrate First Nations, Inuit, and Métis worldviews and perspectives into learning environments. Further, the First Peoples Principles of Learning describe pedagogical approaches that identify common elements in the varied teaching and learning approaches that prevail within particular First Peoples societies. And all teachers are encouraged to use those principles and this document called Aboriginal Worldviews and Perspectives. The one I haven't talked about is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's and Girls Calls for Justice, which do have implications for the 89 action plans that have to be attended to and for which everyone is accountable over the next 5 years. So that's our context. I'm going to now talk a little bit about methodology, and this, as you can see, is all about community-engaged research. In Canada, university human research ethics, federal granting agencies, and Indigenous communities require that non-Indigenous researchers conduct studies with Indigenous communities and not on them. Any community engagement in research exists on a spectrum, from research with little or no community involvement, all the way to something that is community-led. In our case, it's community-based participatory research. And what determines where you are on the spectrum are the equity indicators and the contextual factors. So in our case, 8 partner groups working together use community-based participatory research to do our study. So we have the University of Victoria, the Pacific Opera, based in Victoria, School District 61, Greater Victoria, their Indigenous Department. This is the Victoria Native Friendship Centre, representing about 18,000 urban Indigenous people in Victoria. The BC Music Educators Association, representing approximately 700 music educators in the province. UBC, the Ministry of Education, especially the Indigenous branch, and another school district in the North Okanagan in the center of the province. So we also have a steering committee composed mostly of urban Indigenous people from several First Nations and Métis communities who are members of the partner groups. The steering committee guides the research, and 2 local Indigenous elders have advised us along our journey. In 2019, for our 3rd study, the steering committee recommended that we apply for funding so that we might create a conference to study the issue, inviting 200 people to discuss and share their ideas. That is, Indigenous leads from all 60 BC school districts, knowledge keepers from the territories on which the school districts are located, and music educators. We obtained funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and our partner groups. And over 2 years during COVID restrictions, together we conceived and organized this Indigenous-centered conference, which we eventually held in May 2022. Steering committee members insisted on the imperative of the process by which we came to consensus, regardless of the length of time it took to do so. And they trusted that the integrity of our decision-making would be reflected in the final outcome. The Everything is Connected conference was unlike any conference we have attended or organized. It prioritized local protocols, such as welcome to territory, and formal and informal witnessing. It featured a space for those in need of healing and smudging, spontaneous and planned opportunities for drumming and singing, and a local First Nation floor manager who ensured that all attendees were taken care of and that support was provided to those experiencing difficulties. We hired Indigenous keynote speakers, MCs, elders, videographers, and students. This fall, we hired and trained 2 Indigenous community members associated with 2 of our partner groups to help code the knowledge shared and created at the conference to mitigate the real possibility of misinterpretation or erasure of knowledge due to ethic perspectives. In the new year, they will assist us as we use both codebook and reflexive forms of thematic analysis. Now, researchers who wish to demonstrate greater objectivity in qualitative research analysis often code in pairs and use codebooks. We also did the same. We coded in pairs and we used a codebook. But our objective was not to be objective. It was to ensure that for every transcription, at least one coder and an analyst had an Indigenous lens, thereby facilitating emic interpretation of phrases and words spoken by knowledge keepers. So to date, we have coded 8 workshops and the guided conversation, and the 4 initial themes that we generated, and these are very, very flexible at the moment: Indigenous ways of knowing and being in community, policy including curriculum and pedagogy, relationships including examples of work done together, and ways forward. These themes are in flux, as I said, as we have 4 remaining sessions yet to code. Before I turn to my colleague Scott Goble, I would like to acknowledge Hector as our project manager for the length of the project, and Beth, who was the research assistant from January to November before she gained employment at Memorial University. I also have infographics here for any of you who are interested. I have several copies if you would like. This is from our 2nd study. And I can offer access to the videos. These were professionally made by videographers of the conference, and I can provide you with the URL if you're interested. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anita. Okay, I suggest that we go immediately to the 2nd speaker, which is Scott Globe, and I believe he will be online with us.
Hello. Following on Anita's self-introduction, I will begin by introducing myself in the way we've learned from our Indigenous research partners also. My name is Scott Goble. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, USA, a city named for Cielth, who was chief of the Duwamish tribe when Europeans first began settling that area in the mid-19th century. My heritage is mixed Norwegian, English, Dutch, and German, and I am grateful to live and work now in Vancouver, British Columbia, BC, on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. In this presentation, I will share findings from the guided conversation that took place during the Everything is Connected conference in May 2022, in which we sought to identify the locally situated educational practices that are presently enabling music teachers and community partners to foreground Indigenous worldviews and musics in their teaching. The conversation was led by Joe Heslop, a former school music teacher of Cree and mixed European settler ancestry, presently working on a special equity project for the BC Ministry of Education and on leave from his position as District Principal of Indigenous Education in Mission, BC. Joe was tasked with leading music educators and Indigenous leaders from approximately 40 school districts, plus culture bearers from their local communities, to answer 3 specific questions during a 75-minute session. I'll share those questions with you now. Question number 1. What educational practices, especially locally developed approaches, have you and your partners in your community found to be effective for respectively integrating Indigenous worldviews in music classes? The primary ways teachers reported integrating Indigenous worldviews in their music classes involved the hiring of local elders, Indigenous knowledge keepers, and culture bearers to participate in teaching their classes. Once engaged, these Indigenous teaching partners primarily taught singing, drumming, and drum making, also telling stories that emphasize First Peoples values and processes, like respect, humility, and relationship building, not musical concepts or performance outcomes. Some partners involved students in enacting a local story with songs and dances at a school concert or music festival in order to illuminate the meaning the songs hold in the ongoing life of the local Indigenous community. It's important to note that a First Nations song can be used only with permission from the one who owns it. The ownership of the song, that is, by a family, a band, or a chief, must be acknowledged whenever the song is sung, and it must be made clear that permission has been granted whenever that song is used in a class or for other purposes. Observance of these protocols, when integrating Indigenous worldviews in music classes, is an important way of demonstrating respect. Question number 2. What are some ways of teaching that have been effective in building relationships and understandings among Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples? Relationships are of primary concern among Indigenous peoples. So, collaborations between teachers and their Indigenous teaching partners require an investment of time and energy for the building and maintenance of reciprocal relationships, and ongoing consultation and collaboration are hallmarks of them. Due to their connection with the land, First Nations elders and culture bearers introduce songs from the local Indigenous community on whose traditional lands the school is situated, and they sing and teach them in the language of the local First Nations people. Songs are regarded as an important tool for teaching and sustaining traditional languages, and some culture bearers and teachers have devised creative ways of advancing traditional languages, even singing translated texts of European children's songs in the local people's language. Drumming and culture clubs have been created in some schools, and the history of Indigenous peoples is taught, along with consideration of different worldviews and relational ethics. In some schools, specific times of the day or week are designated for Indigenous speakers from the district, and teachers and their Indigenous teaching partners also establish planned times for collaboration. Question number 3. How might learning about these practices inform and guide the work of other music educators and community partners in British Columbia? Participants suggested that deliberate collaboration among administrators, Indigenous partners, and teachers could inform the work within districts, and that sharing of successful approaches among school districts could strengthen it further. They stressed that funded involvement of local Indigenous artists, musicians, and knowledge keepers in music classes could advance the unpacking of biases, untruths, and privilege, leading to what one participant described as, quote, creative means by which we can gather and heal together, end quote. Near the end of the guided conversation, Joe asked if the session could be allocated additional time. The conversation continued 20 minutes additionally, and Joe raised 3 further questions. Question number 4. How can the educational practices that teachers and indigenous partners in their communities found to be effective inform and guide the work of other music educators and community partners in the province. The practices found to be most effective were those that involved collaboration, as between a music teacher and an indigenous culture bearer. One participant noted that some school districts do not provide much opportunity for collaboration. Another stressed that instruction must be not pan-diginizing, but rather take into account the unique worldview and musical practices of the specific peoples on whose land the school is situated. Question number 5. What are the implications of these emerging practices for music teacher education? Well, at present, the British Columbia Ministry of Education does not recognize or fund elementary music education in grades K through 6, although some elementary schools do use music classes to provide so-called release time for K-12 classroom teachers, and some universities in the province thus offer courses to prepare elementary music teachers anyway. One participant asserted, quote, "The very best curricular tool and the very best curricular people to implement all these things we've discussed are elementary music educators," end quote. This suggests that all university music teacher education programs should include preparation in elementary music education as a means of advancing the understanding of indigenous worldviews, and that such preparation should take place not only in university classes, but also in courses made accessible to working teachers post-graduation. Question number 6, what are the implications of music teachers engaging in this work respectfully with indigenous peoples? What are possible benefits, barriers, concerns, and questions? We will share our answers to these questions in the papers and articles we publish after we've finished analyzing all our data. Since the May conference, delegates have shared with us actions taken as a direct result of their participation. The BC Music Educators Association, BCMEA, one of our research partners, encouraged the organizers of their October conference to be proactive in ensuring that the topic of multiple workshops was Indigenous knowledge in music classes. 260 of the 870 delegates attended at least one of the 6 sessions. The organization's executive members are also organizing online professional development in February 2023 that will include a session for music educators and Indigenous leads to continue conversing and planning. In one school district, the Fine Arts Coordinator and Indigenous Education Department are creating secondary school music lesson plans, videos, and songs, and expanding the already comprehensive resources available to elementary teachers. Discussions are also underway to create resources for early learning years. At least 2 school districts are designing a required graduation course in Indigenous studies as an Indigenous-focused music composition or music ensemble course. Music educators in 2 other school districts have organized fall professional development for music educators to support teachers in decolonizing and indigenizing their teaching. One rural music educator has reached out to the local Indigenous community, and they have partnered to provide music opportunities to students who attend the school on the reserve. In addition to these efforts, 14 music education professors across Canada, who had attended the conference as informal witnesses to the event, have jointly submitted a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Connections Grant, an application that is, so that they, along with Indigenous research partners, might meet together in May 2023 to discuss their respective research efforts to decolonize and indigenize music education at primary, secondary, and tertiary levels in partnership with local Indigenous communities. We will learn next month if this small grant application is successful. Our joint goal is that the meeting will be the catalyst for a second grant application that will finance the research in all 14 locations if we are successful. Thank you so much for your interest and your attention.
Okay, thank you, Scott Online. And now we have a strange situation, I think. We will listen to Hector Vazquez Cordova, who is actually here in the room, but he only recently got his Canadian passport, so it was foreseen that he could be here with us only online. So he has a video. But Hector, maybe stand up, people see you. Okay, so Hector's talk will be about community immersive learning experience for student music education teachers. We watch your video, Hector.
Currently, there is a global movement to affirm the value of Indigenous knowledge and the need for their worldview to be present in education as stated in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Particularly important for the purpose of this study was section number 1 of the declaration, which states that, quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their culture, such as visual and performing arts and literature, end of quote. In 2019, I had the opportunity to travel to the Huasteco region in northern Veracruz, Mexico, to meet and interview Huasteco music culture bearers as part of my field work for my doctoral study. The Huasteco region covers 6 states of what is now known as Mexico. The Huasteco region is a multi-ethnic territory where 6 indigenous groups and mestizo people have constructed a dynamic and vibrant cultural exchange, while at the same time continuing to preserve their unique languages and worldviews. According to participants' narratives, one of the main obstacles for collaboration was that educators working at the local schools were not familiar with local indigenous and mestizo cultural practices, including music making. At the same time, Mexico's national curriculum does not address the need to embrace indigenous perspectives in the classroom. Participants stress the need for educators at the local level to connect with Huasteco culture bearers in order to embrace local ways of knowing and being in the classrooms, especially given the high rate of children and youth who hold indigenous ancestry. To date, music education researchers have learned that the most effective way of embedding indigenous ways of knowing and being in music classes is through collaboration with local indigenous culture bearers. When reflecting on potential reasons why teachers are not embedding indigenous ways of knowing in their classroom, it became more evident that teachers and teacher candidates are a product of the school system itself. In other words, teachers become an extension of their own experience in their K-12 education and their post-secondary education. Therefore, it is crucial to shift the paradigm by which music educators are trained if the music education profession aims to produce a social impact by meeting the goals and aspirations of the given communities where their educational practice occur. My question is the following. Are post-secondary education institutions preparing teacher candidates to meet the needs and aspirations of a given community, or is post-secondary education failing to provide the students with tools to engage in diverse teaching environments? In this case, I refer to scenarios beyond embedding indigenous ways of knowing in the classroom, but also contexts where teachers might face scenarios such as high number of refugees or newcomer students with diverse backgrounds, with diverse cultural backgrounds, schools located in areas of poverty or extreme poverty, and working in communities who have experienced or continue to experience high rates of violence and trauma. Last summer, I took a group of 7 music teacher candidates from the University of Veracruz in Mexico on a 7-day immersive learning experience to learn from Huasteco music culture bearers in the Huasteco region. This experience was the first part of a comparative study for my postdoctoral program. In order to fund the Mexican project, I applied and obtained 2 research grants, one from Isme Sempre and another from Agigento, Music for Social Change. In the fall of 2021, with the support of the Music Education Department at the School of Music at the University of Veracruz and the guidance of a local organization called Huastecos Unidos por un Progreso, Huastecos United for Progress, we started a series of workshops. The first 2 workshops were open to all music education students. These two first workshops were broadcast via Zoom due to COVID-19 restrictions. In these workshops, Roman Güemes, a well-known and respected elder in the Huasteco community, provided students with an overview of the diverse cultural practices in which music is embedded in the Huasteco region. After the 2 first workshops, with the collaboration of a colleague, Ariel Martinez, a music education professor at the University of Veracruz, I recruited participants who were interested in taking part in the immersion experience. Students who expressed their interest to participate in the immersion experience attended 2 more workshops whose goal was to provide them with an introduction of how to play Huasteco music. Huasteco music has influence from Spanish, African, and indigenous musics and Western-inspired instruments. The music is used for ritual and secular purposes for mestizo and indigenous communities. The total of 4 workshops provided students with a foundational understanding of Huasteco culture and music. The immersion experience took place between June 27 and July 3rd. a group of 7 music teacher candidates from the University of Veracruz, 1 music education professor from the University of Veracruz, 1 representative from Huastecos Unidos por un Progreso, and I traveled to the Huasteca region. We visit Huasteco music culture bearers who are currently leading workshops to teach Huasteco music to children and youth, and music culture bearers who are deeply involved in ritual practices. Huastecos Unidos for Progress play a vital role in connecting us with key people in the Huasteca region. In this presentation, I provide initial findings from a focus group conducted with music teacher candidates at the end of the immersion experience. Music teacher candidates' narratives are important to understand how the immersion experience might influence their future professional practice and also the implication of a learning experience outside of a controlled space such as a classroom. Studies reflected on the cultural protocols around being welcome to communities and gaining the trust to be invited to participate in cultural events. In this regard, Hermes, a 4-year music teacher candidate, reflected that the nature of this project allowed him to learn how to build relationships of trust with community members. Quote, I don't think I learned something about this at school, or there was not a subject that could provide you some orientation about how to form relationships. This is something private. This is part of Huasteco tradition and cosmology. It takes time to understand. It's not even about understanding, it's about having the chance to live the experience. In order to live the experience, you need to know somebody in the community who invites you. They need to consider you someone who is worthy of being invited and have the opportunity to live this experience. I don't know, it's just a long way that we need to follow. End of quote. During our immersion experience, we had the opportunity to visit 4 towns and get to know firsthand how music is transmitted, attended cultural events, and have the opportunity to foster relationships of trust with local culture bearers. After the immersion experience concluded, some students have gone back to the Huasteca region and continue to attend cultural events. This shows the level of commitment to keep learning about Huasteco culture and form relationships of trust. By being part of cultural activities and also hearing about different uses that the music has in the Huasteco region, music teacher candidates challenge their own lived experience in regards to the Western approach to music making. Alejandro, a 4-year music teacher candidate, reflected on what he experienced in the diverse communities that we visit. Quote, what I saw is mainly that music is not just an accessory. It is not something for aesthetic contemplation. Music is something that has a practical function within the community. Music is something that a community does for the community itself. This is a completely different approach to the way we study music. Sometimes you get in your head about being the best violinist, that you need to win a competition, get a concert master chair, or get a scholarship. Here, the relationship with music is very different. End of quote. One of the things that impacted the group the most was the close relationship that music has with ritual practices and the connection that this has with the natural world, which once again provide a completely different framework when compared with the way in which students engage with music in their schooling. Jonathan, a 4-year music teacher candidate, mentioned the impact that had on him the connection between music, spirituality, and connection to nature. Quote, at least in my case, I see music as a form of social entertainment. Here I see that music is connected to a much deeper level, at a more spiritual level. I mean, I cannot even manage to comprehend. This is something very strong that really gets my attention. It is the way in which people are really into what they believe and the mental state that they can reach through music. This is something that goes beyond my level of understanding. This is something that I really admire and respect a lot. This is something really powerful, magical, something that is related with the worldview. This really impacts me. We study indigenous peoples, we study their ways of knowing as something from the past. We lose the chance to acknowledge that we have here this form of knowledge. It's about asking the hill for permission, something that seems really simple but that you get a lot of teaching from. It's about learning to respect Mother Nature, to understand why we are part of her, that we need to feel part of her. We are part of a community. We are part of the earth. We are not the most important thing as we believe from our anthropocentric view. Here, here it is different. You are not the most important thing in the world. This is a way to connect with local indigenous ways of knowing, from which we can learn a lot. I am thinking in regards to situations such as global warming, which affect us all. The initial finding shows that this immersion experience transcends the opportunity to reflect on how Western music is taught and the pedagogical approaches that are used. Rather, this immersion experience provides us all with the opportunity to challenge our own assumptions about local indigenous ways of knowing and being, and consider music making not as an end, but instead as a tool to connect us to each other as human beings and also to our natural world. Thank you for listening to this presentation.
And the last presentation for this session, before the Q&A, we listen to Kim Boeskov. He's from the Rhythmic Music Conservatory in Copenhagen, and he will talk about interprofessional collaboration as a tool to strengthen young people's artistic citizenship. Kim.
Thank you very much. Interprofessional collaboration has been identified as a key to widening access and participation in arts activities for children and young people. And in this presentation, I will share some insights from a national development program in Denmark, initiated by the Ministry of Culture. My role in this program is to conduct a research-based evaluation of the 21 local projects funded by this national program. So, the program is called Seize the Engagement and has two overarching goals. First of all, it aims to develop new approaches to the facilitation of arts activities for children and young people in order to widen the access to such activities and in order to strengthen participation in those activities. Second, the program seeks to develop new structures and networks for interprofessional collaboration within the local projects to support such practices. In this way, the ambition is to create more sustainable solutions to how the publicly funded music and arts schools and other cultural institutions can work closely together with educational institutions, leisure time institutions, and community organizations in order to democratize arts activity. Even though Denmark has, like other Nordic countries, a quite comprehensive publicly funded system for voluntary arts education that in principle should make art activities available to all children and young people, research has shown that those opportunities are primarily benefiting the wide middle-class families. In order to legitimize their work, cultural institutions are impelled to become more inclusive and find more socially responsible ways of working. Through this national development program, I've had the privilege to work with the local projects in formulating a shared understanding of what the purpose of developing these new practices and interprofessional collaborative structures basically is. And this has led us to a concept of children and young people's artistic citizenship. Using the term citizenship, we want to pay attention to the connection between participating in artistic activities and the foundational rights and opportunities of all children and young people for expressing themselves, having a sense of belonging, and being recognized as full members of the society. We are drawing on an understanding of citizenship as a dynamic concept, not merely as a legal status, but as something achieved and constantly negotiated through participating in the social, cultural, and symbolic practices of everyday communal life. Children and young people's active participation in arts activities are in this way connected to opportunities for experiencing and exploring citizenship, a means to take up a position in the current social order and at the same time an opportunity for articulating visions of a future social order. The concept of citizenship developed here is closely related to a humanistic aesthetic conception of Bildung, where children are fully recognized as beings rather than merely becomings, in the sense that children's own sense-making, expressions, and experiences are recognized and valued. In order to operationalize this concept, we are working with three main dimensions. Access is connected to the foundational rights given to all children and young people in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to participate fully in the cultural and artistic life of society. Therefore, the local projects are working to ensure equal opportunities for engagement in the arts for different groups that are currently excluded from such activities. Participation is connected to children and young people's agency, that they have a say in decision-making processes, are able to share and express their opinions, and are positioned in such a way that they can influence and shape the social and cultural context they live in. Artistic citizenship is thereby tightly connected to an idea of democratic participation in which ownership and agency become primary criteria. Finally, the concept of artistic citizenship is concerned with children and young people's well-being as a response to the mental health crisis among children and young people that we are currently experiencing. The connection to well-being does not merely signify that engaging in artistic activities might contribute to supporting children and young people's well-being, although it certainly seems like there is some potential for exactly this. But just as important, the point is to hold cultural and educational institutions responsible for considering how they can systematically work towards artistic and educational practices that are actually responding to this major societal challenge. The connection between art and well-being points to a task and an obligation rather than well-being being something automatically following from engaging in music and arts activities. Constituted by these three dimensions, the concept of artistic citizenship can be seen to express the political vision embedded in this particular national initiative, but our hope is to inspire institutions as well as policymakers on both municipal and national levels to implement this as a guiding concept for the development of future cultural policy. So, who are the professionals working together around children and young people's artistic citizenship in this program? One of the exciting aspects of this initiative is the range of publicly funded institutions as well as community organizations involved in developing new collaborative structures. A main actor in this setting is the Municipal Music and Arts Schools, a system of art schools for voluntary arts activities found in all Scandinavian countries. As I said earlier, although these institutions should theoretically provide access for all children, they are primarily serving the white middle-class families with high educational levels and incomes. One of the keys to turn this around is to develop new collaborations between arts educators from the municipal music and arts schools and institutions like public schools, kindergartens, leisure time centers, public libraries, and community organizations in which a much more diverse population of children and young people are represented. The concept of children and young people's artistic citizenship formulated here can be seen as an attempt to create a common purpose that makes sense for all of these institutions by connecting arts activities to broader issues of democratic participation and well-being. So, interprofessional collaboration is a term that is increasingly coming into focus not only in relation to arts education. We are witnessing a turn towards interprofessionality as an important means of addressing the complex societal challenges we face connected to health, climate change, and so forth. Interprofessionality is often emphasized for the potential of raising quality in the welfare services to different communities, because an interprofessional starting point allows for more holistic approaches and solutions with the interest of the individual person in mind. Also, for widening access to arts education, interprofessional collaboration has been identified as a key for social innovation that enables artists and arts educators to respond to social issues to a larger extent. Genuine interprofessional collaborations are generally understood as directed towards the development of new ways of working and a production of knowledge that surpass what a single profession would be able to generate, and herein lies the great potential for innovation. However, from research connected to this area, we also know that establishing such genuine collaborations is easier said than done. Bringing different professionals together with different competencies, worldviews, understandings, and ways of working, comes with a lot of challenges. And this is also what we are witnessing in the national program that I am following. So let me briefly share with you some of the most central insights. One of the clear results from this study is that interprofessional collaboration is indeed a key to supporting children and young people's artistic citizenship. The local projects that are most successful in establishing a genuine interprofessional practice are also the ones that seem to be able to remove some of the barriers for children's participation in arts activities. A successful interprofessional collaboration in this context can be understood as a shared practice. A shared practice is based on a common purpose that are experienced as meaningful for all involved, both on an institutional level and on the practitioner level. It is based on a shared sense of ownership with an equal investment of time, energy, and resources. And 3 dimensions have proven particularly important in this regard. The first one is relations between professionals. It's important that professionals working together understand each other's professional starting points and ways of working, respect each other, and are actually interested in learning from each other and developing something new together. Organization and structure. A genuine interprofessional collaboration needs to be based on structure that allow for shared ownership. There needs to be time for shared planning and evaluation of the activities, for meetings, for continuous dialogue, which is quite often a challenge when professionals with very different ways of working and time schedules are supposed to work together. And finally, for interprofessional collaboration to work out, there needs to be a clear sense of leadership. Practitioners working together need to be working within a clear framework so that they know what they're supposed to do and so that they feel that they are actually contributing to something valuable for the institutions. It's also important that professionals are granted authority to make decisions on their own connected to the activities in order for collaborations to work smoothly. So my time is up. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kim. I invite all the speakers here on the stage. Thank you. I think we have half an hour, something like that. Yeah, for this, we have 2 questions already here. But maybe I will ask some questions first, and then I open up to everybody in the audience. It was a very diverse and similar. Scott is not joining us, I believe. No, I don't know. I don't know. Was it plenty? But he was going to be online. Ah, he's there. Ah, okay, there you are. Okay, thank you for being there. Okay, maybe I have a very blunt question for the Canadian speakers. So the title of the panel was Interprofessional Collaboration. My question would be for you, like, could you tell me briefly how you see the interprofessional in your research?
So we have our 8 partners, various professions. In education, in music education, in Indigenous governance with the Native Friendship Center. And so that's the way it works for us. But I think there's also another dimension. The word professional sometimes implies a certain amount of education and I mean tertiary education. And one of the groups of people that we have come to recognize as professional and full of wisdom are the knowledge keepers that we work with. And I don't think that's often considered when we talk about interprofessional, right? It's like it's a whole new dimension of what it is to know and who holds the knowledge. And so, yeah, so for us it's an expanded awareness of what is considered professional in our context.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Also connecting with this, so there's much writing about the fact that with Indigenous research, you need to ensure that you are not doing Indigenous research about Indigenous people or on Indigenous people, that it needs to be for Indigenous people with Indigenous people. And so those collaborations and those partnerships are paramount if you are looking at anything to do with Indigenous content. And this applies to every area.
And someone online, Graça Mota, has a question about this. So you can keep the microphone for a second. Researching with and not on Indigenous populations, what are the significant implications from this for any research carried out in other settings, for example, music education months?
Sorry, what was the last word?
So she asks, what are the implications of this phrase or this practice? What are the implications for any research carried out in other settings, for example, music education ones?
Music education ones. Oh, ones, okay. It was just the last word I didn't hear. So for a long time, and this still continues to happen, that any research done with marginalized populations has actually not been with marginalized populations. That has been extractivist, taking from the marginalized populations in order to use the information that they have, the music that they have, and taking it and doing other things with it, taking it outside of the context that it should exist within.
Yeah.
And that it's, when it's taken outside the context, it's the researcher that is deciding how that's going to be used in that context, rather than the people who these things are taken away from. So it is very colonial in nature to do that. And that's why it is so important to ensure ongoing consent with marginalized populations, that you aren't just getting one-time consent for things, that you're not just taking content, that you are actually in a constant state of, like a constant feedback loop, that things are being used in the right way, that they're being used in the way that they're intended to be used, or in a way that is permitted to be used, instead of just making assumptions that it's okay to do things because somebody said once that you could do something with it. So the context becomes very important.
Yes, and maybe over to Hector, because you were working in the community with your project. Maybe this is even further than what she's saying now, like, so you're not only working with them, but as well in their context.
I think in this case, it's really important to, and I guess it's what we did, in this case, with the support of a local organization, a series of workshops before going to the Huasteco region, because it was important for students to understand that it was not a vacation time, right? That we just to have fun and get, a week away. No, it was important that they got in advance an introduction of what we will be witnessing, what might be some protocols around how to build the relationships. And of course, in a week is not enough. It's what the title of the presentation is, the beginning of a journey. This is a long, it's like a journey that students still continue to go to the Huasteca region because they have started forming those relationships. So I guess the idea is that with these collaborations and be working with indigenous communities to disrupt, in a way, the idea that the professionals just are nurtured at institutions such as universities, is to disrupt this idea that we are the ones who know, but rather see each other with our partners as equals, in order to disrupt the idea that we are on an ivory tower where we are privileged. We just get to go and take something and then just publish, because it's something that has happened historically with, especially with indigenous knowledges. And rather, us, instead of inviting them to our institution, because we are invited to operate within our own rules, like come to university because it's where I feel safe. I'm going to invite you for my class, and that is going to be it. Rather, we go, and now we are that so-called other. Because when we go there, sometimes we don't know the language. So we were like, I don't know what this person is saying. So now we're putting in the spot of that so-called other. We're trying to we are in a kind of more like a vulnerable position. So I think it's important to see that students, in this case, music teacher candidates, can see that we live with a lot of privilege. And so that's a first step. This is not, to be 7 days there doesn't change everything. It's just the beginning to start shifting their perspective. So I think that's a way to disrupt the power dimension that is between what happened at the university as an ivory tower and what happened outside. So it's just disrupting those barriers, which, sometimes is hard to let go.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I make the bridge to your story, Kim, because it's for me links to what you were talking about well-being as not as well-being. We understand it like feeling well, but you said it's more like a task or an obligation for institutions to work around another concept of music education in this sense. So actually, it relates maybe to what Hector problematizes as the power of these institutions going somewhere and taking something from indigenous people.
Yeah, I think it could. I think in the context that I'm working in, it has become increasingly important for the cultural institutions, for arts educational institutions to understand themselves as part of local communities, working with local problems, desires, and caring for the community also. Instead of thinking, for example, the music and art schools, instead of thinking of themselves as part of national educational systems connected to the higher music education institutions, for example, really focused on educating their students in order for them to leave the community to go to the big cities to study at the conservatories. So instead of thinking of themselves as local institutions caring for their community, caring for the well-being of the students in the community. So that could maybe be a link to that way of seeing your role as an arts educator and as an arts institution or cultural institution.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe one other question for you, Kim, online from Grasa as well. She's active. Being beings rather than becomings, Kim, could you elaborate a little on these terms of working and researching with rather than on children?
Yeah.
The same direction as the former question.
Yeah, I think this comes from a need to, when working in educational institutions and in also in kindergartens, in public schools, there is a great attention to, at least in Denmark, I know also in other countries, of course, to primarily see children as someone who are becoming someone else. So in kindergarten, we prepare them to go to school. In school, we prepare them to go to high school or higher education, and there we prepare them to work. So we are constantly handling children or being with children as they should become someone else. So this concept of artistic citizenship really wants to emphasize the value of being of the children and young people, and value the experiences, the expressions, the playfulness, the sense-making that are happening in the moment, instead of thinking of those moments as moments in a larger process to become someone else. But because, of course, they are also becoming someone else, or we all are becoming as we are also being. So it's not to say that we should not be concerned with becoming. I think that, of course, we should, but in order for us to make space for children, young people's being, we need to really adopt that as the starting point for these arts activities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Maybe I look at the audience. Yeah, Jeff. Is there a microphone? Yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. I was wondering if any of you would like to reflect on the relationship between the concept of SIM, or social impact of making music, and decolonising and indigenizing music education. In any way that strikes you. But for example, do you see SIM as a tool or concept of decolonisation, or do you see it as a tool or concept that needs decolonising?
Who would like to answer? Yes, Scott, would you like to answer? Did you understand the question?
I think I do, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the things that those of us who've been working on the Everything is Connected project have been considering, and that Anita and I have in particular discussed and have written a paper on that is forthcoming, has to do with the way that music education might need to change in recognition of the extraordinary diversity of people who we're working with, the students who are coming through our classes. And that means actually giving attention to the worldviews and what we're calling the epistemes, the ways of knowing of different peoples who are represented in those student groups that actually are in our classes. And in this way, what we're able to do is to change music education a bit so that not only are we considering the music that's being made at a particular time, but we're thinking about where that music came from and what it meant to the people who were the creators of it, what it means now, and what might be happening as we're creating new musics going forward. In other words, what are those meanings and how are they reflective of who we are as human beings, recognizing that we may be very different, those of us who comprise a classroom. In that way, it's actually shifting the focus from the music as a particular art object, or a focus on music as an art or whatnot, to a focus on music as a practice, and the consideration of how different musics or different musical practices actually are reflective of the people who they come from. In this way, we are essentially decolonizing. We're no longer suggesting that the concept of art that has been central in the practices of Western art music for such a long time, and which has predominated in music education, is necessarily where we should be situating ourselves going forward. More to say about that, but there's a start.
Okay. Someone else wants to say something? So maybe more specific, if you can, to SIM, so social impact of music making. This social impact, maybe you can reflect.
The thing that I find so particularly refreshing about the social impact of music making, the SIMM-posium and the whole orientation here, is that it is considering things in a social way, as opposed to considering art objects, music as an art object in that particular way, which, as I say, has been central in music education quite broadly. It's the influence of the Western art practices and the concept of art that's at the center of musical practices that have been predominant in the schools. And the thing that's so refreshing about SIM is that we're now in this forum in which we're now able to consider not just particular musics, but actually all musicking, all music making in ways that we maybe haven't considered previously.
Okay, thank you.
I can go now if you'd like. I would also like to acknowledge the fact that decolonization is a process. Oh, sorry, I'm not talking directly enough into the microphone. So decolonization is a process, something to be continuously and continually working towards. So I would not say that either one is necessarily the case, but it is something that we all, as educators, not just music educators, but as educators, should be working towards. And also, I was thinking about the connections to the work of Ibram X. Kendi and how to be an anti-racist. And in his work, he speaks about if you are not being anti-racist, you are being racist. And so I had connection in my mind towards that, that if we are not working towards decolonization, we are colonizing.
Okay. Jeff, is this enough answer to your question? Or you're not satisfied?
No, that's not a criticism of the responses. I think that there's a long way to go.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more to be said about the relationship between SIM and decolonisation.
Yeah.
That's not a criticism at all of the responses. I mean, as somebody who works in a Latin American context, a certain model of SIM involves an intervention by an outside group towards a marginalised group, and one could say that the first SIM workers in Latin America were the Spanish missionaries. That in that sense, one could say that a certain model of a SIM is thoroughly colonialist. Now, that's not all of SIM work, of course, but I think so in a Latin American context, there's a question about whether SIM is, in its historical roots, very deeply colonialist.
Okay, that's a critical reflection, yeah.
Every time we step into someone else's territory, we have to recognize that we need to, the whole theme around listening, that was prevalent yesterday. I think that when you enter into someone's territory, you need to listen. And that's how you can begin to decolonize. There's an author called Dylan Robinson, who is Stalo, and he has written a book called Hungry Listening that has really affected the way I think about things. And I would recommend that for any person wanting to do collaboration. Like SIM many SIM projects are about collaboration to ensure the non-extractivism, to ensure that there's respect about listening on territory and what that entails, and to ensure that voice is equal, and that there are some aspects that are incommensurable, that you can't just do this wonderful bridging and everything is all hunky-dory. That there are some things that, because worldviews are different. And I think that's where we have to stretch ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it says my device is not working anymore, but it's fine, yeah. Maybe another question, or you have two questions left. Yes, Dave.
Thank you all for such wonderful, inspiring presentations. It occurs to me that the ethical dimensions of all of the work that you do are very important and also very complex. So I'd just like to ask, and I hope it isn't too personal a question, but I was just really interested to know how do you approach your own ethical responsibilities as researchers?
Okay. Who wants to start? Not everybody has to answer, but maybe. Yeah, okay.
Well, that's a really it's, I guess, a question that can be answered and in the particular context where research takes place. And I'm saying this coming from a background where I do the collaboration with the group from policy to practice with the four of us who are here from Canada, but also I can compare with my experience in Mexico. And every place has, let's say, their own protocols about how to be ethical about research, even what permission looks like. For me, was a completely new experience when I entered a Canadian institution, right? What the ethical is from the institution, but then also what is ethical from your perspective. It's always kind of that dynamic that you need to negotiate. And the same thing happened with me in Mexico. And I think it all comes to be accountable to your, in this case I will say participants, I will say collaborators or colleagues, because you're gonna be back to the community. So if you don't do things in the right way, next time they will not open the door for you. So you need to follow what they say. For example, from my doctoral research, they told me, we need to build collaboration with educators. So this is the work that needs to be done. So it's for me to start looking ways to make this happen. So how are we going to be ethical to that responsibility is to look ways for these projects to occur, and with the support of Ghent, for example, and with support of Isme Sempre, it's like how this is possible to be ethical with them is to give back what they ask for, and finding the financial, sometimes even it's about, the financial means to do the projects that they want us to do, because in the case of Mexico and as many countries in Latin America, like funding is really limited. So we need to make a lot with whatever we got. So that's my responsibility. My ethical responsibility with them is to give back what they ask for, which is in a way parallel but separate from the ethical, like the form that you make at the university. Yes, interviews, I will ask, I will pass the sheet where they will say yes, it's okay to take force, whatever. It's about what you do, what is given, to give back what they were asked for. So that's the way that you are accountable to your relationship, because everything comes about relationships. You will go back. If you don't do things well, you will not be welcome. Mm-hmm. So be accountable by your actions, not by filling up the checklist.
Ethical forms, not the ethical forms. Someone else wants to say something about that? Yeah. And then I go to the next question.
So connecting with what Hector was speaking about, but I am responsible to my community. And so with that, I'm built relationships within the community. I'm building relationships within my community. And there is some knowledge which is not meant to be shared outside the community. And this is something that I've been interacting with a lot, because I personally, in my own research, I also don't like to use the word research for what I was doing. I was reclaiming my culture in what I was doing. So research is not the right word for that at the same time. But I learned so much information, but so much of that information should not be published. Mm-hmm. It should not be taken outside of the community.
Okay.
Since I am a member of the community, I can learn it and I hold it and share it within the community, but I cannot share it without that. So it's important to have permissions to do things, and the ongoing permission to do things, to check in with that, making sure that I'm doing things in a good way, that I'm not doing things in a way that I shouldn't be doing.
Okay, thank you. It's very clear. Maybe you have time for one more question.
I'm Agnes Bartens. I'm here from PAL Music UK. PAL Music stands for Palestine, but the PAL bit is Palestine. I was interested in what you said about colonization. I mean, obviously here we are full on in colonization, Have any of you worked with music as cultural and political resistance?
As cultural and political resistance? Resistance.
Because music in Palestine, the musicians make music to resist the occupation.
Okay.
To emphasize their culture.
Yeah.
It also depends on your definition of political within this as well, because an act of political resistance for many Indigenous people is their existence.
Absolutely.
And
to exist, to exist is to resist, in this case. Yes.
And then also to have their teachings, to pass their teachings on to the next generations. That is deeply political, because politics have tried to erase Indigenous people for so long. And so that intimately is very political, but I haven't worked with that in perhaps the way that
In
you're
the activist
asking.
sense, not in the activist sense, maybe you mean, eh? Or
Aside from
different-
the activist sense of existing
Yeah.
and passing on knowledge.
a short answer, because I have to stop, actually. Yeah.
So another word that is used a lot is the notion of resurgence. And this is part of indigenization, and it's on the part of indigenous peoples. And my role as a non-indigenous person is to hold space for that resurgence. That's my job.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to wrap it up because it's 4 o'clock and I think we have a coffee break now. But I would like to thank the panel for the presentations as well, the online, Scott. Thank you a lot. It's very nice.